Hey, fancy seeing the Iron Maiden? I would... No, not that one. The torture method, of course. What's up, nerds? Today we're talking about one of the most well-known torture methods in human history, the Iron Maiden. Don't worry, we're keeping it mostly PG, so no in-depth descriptions or anything like that. But if you get jumpy about these subjects, be advised. If you like all things human, like history, archaeology, literature, art, you're at the right address, so hit that subscribe button and click the bell so you never miss an episode. For those of you blissfully unaware of its existence, the Iron Maiden is an iconic torture device attributed to the European Middle Ages. It essentially looks like a large, iron, human-shaped casket with metal spikes all over the interior. Ouch! As a punishment, a person can be placed inside, and once the lid closes, the metal spikes impale their entire body, leaving them to slowly bleed to death. Yikes! Over the decades, the Iron Maiden has made many appearances in media. In Despicable Me, where the character Edith jumps inside one, in an episode of Scooby-Doo, and even in Season 3 of the YouTube original Escape the Night by Joey Graceffa, just to name a few examples. And fair enough, the device is gruesome both in its cruelty and the uncanny humanoid shape it often takes, which makes it a very cool addition to a villain's lair, a creepy manor, or a thriller series. But where do its origins lie? The first person to mention the Iron Maiden as we know it is Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a German philosopher from the 18th century. He lived from 1759 until 1796, passing away at just 36 years old. He studied theology, philosophy, and philology, the study of language in oral and written historical sources, at the Protestant University of Altdorf, where he eventually became a professor. During his time there, he has taught philosophy, languages, and archaeology in different capacities. It is worth mentioning, however, that there appears to be an even older source mentioning the device, the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary by Johann George Keisler from 1756. The source is rather vague, however, and most historians are pretty skeptical of it, leading most people to agree that Siebenkees' mention is the oldest. Anyways, according to Siebenkees, there was a certain cobbler during the early 1500s that met an untimely end due to the Iron Maiden. A cobbler is someone who makes and/or repairs shoes, by the way. I wasn't able to find the original source, and the sources referencing the story remain quite vague, but here's the gist. The cobbler forges coins as a side hustle, meaning he makes fakes that aren't worth as much. This was often done by mixing the gold or silver with lesser metals. The coin would have more or less the same weight, but not be worth as much as an authentic coin. In 1515, however, the cobbler was caught and subsequently punished. Apparently, Siebenkees writes that the spikes inside the Iron Maiden, while sharp enough to puncture, were not long enough to be fatal. According to him, the cobbler lived for another 2 days before he finally died, bleeding out from his injuries. Clearly, the Iron Maiden was not meant as an execution device per se, but rather as a torture device with a high mortality rate. Siebenkees writes this record in the late 1700s, nearly 300 years after the fact, and he is the first person ever to mention the Iron Maiden in this form. So how did he know what happened to the cobbler? It's simple. He didn't. That's right, Siebenkees' story is almost entirely made up. It's bullshit. But he was far from the only person making up these gruesome stories about the Middle Ages. In fact, it was a relatively common occurrence in the 18th and 19th centuries. But why? During the late 18th and all throughout the 19th centuries, it was a general consensus that back in classical times, so the Greeks and the Romans, people were advanced and civilized. And fair enough, the written sources, the architecture, and the inventions of the time are really impressive. The same goes for the Enlightenment and Romantic periods of the 17th and 18th centuries. But the Middle Ages, literally in between those periods, were considered the dark times. People were convinced that there was a general decrease in knowledge and that the people from the Middle Ages were barbaric and primitive and that they had to fight to survive. But why did they think this? The Middle Ages begin more or less after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. By then, the Roman Empire, which stretched through most of Europe, North Africa and parts of the Middle East, had been divided into two: the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. But while the Western Empire collapsed, the Eastern persisted and became known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire kept most classical influences and flourished through the centuries. Most of Europe, on the other hand, divided back up into smaller individual kingdoms operating on much smaller scales. We see the introduction of the feudal system, in which even small towns became almost entirely self-sufficient. In the early Middle Ages, even trading and exchanging is done on a much smaller scale, much more locally. It means that the long roads, bridges and aqueducts that the Romans had used were no longer necessary and were either abandoned or taken apart, and their parts reused elsewhere. With no one responsible for the roads between towns, we see an increase in criminal activity. Religion moves to the foreground. The church wields enormous power both in day-to-day life and in massive organizations, like the Crusades. As we move to the mid-Middle Ages, we begin to see the first cities breaking away from the feudal system by acquiring city rights. We see the rise of guilds and the expansion of trading across rivers, such as the Hanse cities. Medieval architecture, like the Gothic style, became much more fine-tuned and detailed than the often robust Roman structures that came before them. So while medieval Europe operated on a much smaller scale than the massive empire that came before it, and the general setbacks that development creates, the total picture is a bit more nuanced. However, setbacks are setbacks, and by the time the Enlightenment period rolls around, Europeans are obsessed with everything to do with classical times. The Middle Ages are looked back upon with contempt, something to stay as far removed from as possible, and it results in all sorts of preconceived notions about the time period. In the later 18th and 19th centuries, these preconceived notions and stereotypes were spread around the Western world, regardless of truth. Another common result of this line of thinking was that several torture methods and techniques were wrongly attributed to the Middle Ages. Some methods predated the time period, while others were merely a product of imagination. In fact, some of the most iconic torture methods commonly associated with medieval times, such as the pear of anguish, the bronze bull, and the skull's bridle, were either used more often in other time periods surrounding the Middle Ages, or were invented and used long after the Middle Ages had ended. The same applies to our beloved Iron Maiden. Siebenkees virtually invented the contraption himself in the late 18th century, and by the mid-19th century, authentic medieval Iron Maidens were popping up all over museums and collections in Europe and America, the earliest being the Eiserne Jungfrau in Nuremberg, which appeared as early as 1802. If that ain't the fishiest shit! Of course, the concept of a spiky box is nothing new. In fact, stories of similar contraptions date back all the way to classical times. Yeah, the very same classical times that 19th century people were convinced were advanced and civilized. The most prominent example is the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman statesman and general from the 3rd century BC who rose to fame in his many battles against the Carthaginians during the First Punic War. After defeating the Carthaginians, he led a Roman expedition into Africa, but was captured. He probably died of natural causes. That didn't stop the Romans from making up all sorts of stories about his passing though. The famous Roman poet and philosopher Cicero, for example, had Marcus Atilius Regulus starved to death after purposefully sabotaging negotiations, painting a rather noble picture. Some 650 odd years after the fact, in the 5th century AD, Augustine of Hippo writes a whole nother story in his work City of God. He writes that, and I quote, "The Carthaginians shut Regulus up in a narrow box in which he was compelled to stand, and in which finely sharpened nails were fixed all around him, so that he could not lean upon any part of it without intense pain." The description is very reminiscent of what we know today as the Iron Maiden, and may very well have served as a source of inspiration. There is perhaps a sense of irony surrounding the Iron Maiden. One might even call it the ironic maiden. I'll continue, I'm sorry. But all jokes aside, the fact that the concept of the device can be traced back all the way to civilized classical times and were actively oohed and awed at in the advanced 19th century, but then were wrongly attributed to what these people perceived to be barbaric and primitive people. You know? It's wild really. The way people in the 18th and 19th centuries were obsessed with establishing themselves as the superior, most advanced civilization, especially in Europe. Today we call this phenomenon Eurocentrism, the notion that white Europeans are the superior, most advanced civilization, of others over their time, but also over their own historic predecessors. This line of thinking permeates everywhere in a lot of different ways, but especially over other races, which has done a lot of harm in the process. But they didn't spare their own ancestors either, and in their desperation to make medieval people look as primitive and barbaric as possible, they invented and brought to life one of the most gruesome torture methods that humanity's history has ever seen. Having said that, the Middle Ages did have torture methods. I don't think there's a single time in recorded history where humans haven't been inventing creative ways to hurt each other one way or another. The Middle Ages saw the invention of rat torture and the breaking wheel, for example, but some of the most well-known, most brutal methods, like the pair of anguish and the bridle, were not part of them. So yeah, the Iron Maiden is a real torture device, but one made up by advanced, civilized 19th century people, not medieval peasants. And it was almost certainly never used. Almost. So far. That's all I've got for you today, nerds. Thanks for watching and see you next time.